Alright, in this video I'm going to continue with arrays. I'm going to cover three different topics here. We're going to look at initializing arrays in a different way, multidimensional arrays, and passing arrays to functions. So initializing an array, we've already looked at doing it where you declare the size of the array, and then you could just say for each element it equals some value, and that's fine, but it's not always convenient. So a different approach is to not specify the size of the array and set it equal to a set of curly braces, and inside the braces just list all the values that you want in the array. So let's say I would have a list of ages. So we could have 6, 22, and we separate each one with a comma. 92, 10, 1, 66. Just put some values in there. And I'll make that look a little prettier. And then we could do the same thing with strings. So again, we don't specify how many. We just say it's going to be an array using these brackets there, and then with curly braces, list the values that you want in the array. So Fred, comma, Sally, and I'll just put some names in here. And put a semicolon on the end, and that works just fine. And we would access these arrays the exact same way. So if I wanted to pull a name and then match it with an age, I could say name, and let's say name 4. And then I can list the age there beside that. Ages 4. So from after you initialize it, you still use the array the same way. You're going to need the brackets, you need an index, and you can use this for reading or writing. So let's see what that looks like. And so at index 4 we have Terry, which is our last element. Remember, we start at 0. So even though I have 5 names, I'm off by 1, and the age is 1. So that's an alternative way of initializing arrays. Next, I want to look at multidimensional arrays. So far we've only been working with one dimension, but if you had a grid or you had a spreadsheet or something that you think of in rows and columns, it may be beneficial to use a 2D array. So for this example, I'm going to use chars. I would say char grid, and then you put 2 sets of brackets, and you can think of these as rows and columns. So if I had 4 rows and 10 columns, it would look like that. If I had something like a checkerboard, it would be 8 by 8. They don't have to be the same size. They do have to be positive integers though. And it doesn't have to be char, it can be anything. And you can keep going with this. You could add as many dimensions as you want. After 3 dimensions, it becomes very difficult to wrap your mind around. It's easy to think of a 2D array as a grid or a spreadsheet. But a 3D array, you need to think of something like a stack of cubes or something like that. It would be 3D, and then 4D is just very difficult to wrap your mind around. And normally you're not going to see more than 3 dimensions, although C++ will not put a limit on how many you can use. We'll stick with 2 for right now, just 8 by 8, something like a checkerboard or battleship or something like that. And when you're working with a 2D array, you're going to use 2 for loops. So we'll have an outer loop using I as our variable. And then inside that we will have an inner loop, and we'll use j as our variable. You don't have to use I and j, you can use whatever you want, but they need to be different. So we can't use I twice. J less than 8, J plus plus. And inside the j loop, we can just set the values of our grid, and in the first bracket we put I, and in the second bracket we put j. And you can set these to whatever value you want. So if I just put X there, and then we display that. So I'll write a cout statement right here. To show the X. And then I'll put a little space. And remember, this inner loop controls the row. So once we're done with this row, or controls the columns I should say, once we're done with all the columns in this row, we're going to change rows. And in that case I want to drop down a line, so I'm just going to put an inline right there. And so we have our grid of X's. If I want to initialize a 2D array from the very beginning, I can do it the same way I did with the one-dimensional array, but I do have to specify how big the second dimension is going to be. The first one you can leave open. In the same way, we're going to put brackets there and end it with a semicolon or braces, and then in these braces we're going to add more braces. So I can have my first row of whatever's going in here, and we separate each one with commas, just like that, and keep going until I have all 8 of them, and then I put a comma, drop down, and do the next one. And so it looks something like this. And there we have our array initialized, and you can see what's in each row and what's in each column, and it makes it easy to modify if you wanted to change some of the values, because it's already laid out in the XY format, the grid format. So let's run that, and there you have it. So that's how you could initialize a 2D array if you wanted to. The last thing I want to cover is passing arrays to functions. This can be a little bit tricky if you're working with Visual Studio, because Visual Studio uses Microsoft's Visual C++. It does not support this as well as genuine C++. But we'll look at it anyways. Let's say you have an array, let's say I have an array of integers here with just a few values, and I wanted to pass this array to a function. So I'm going to create a void function up here. To pass it in, I'm going to put the data type, I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to put brackets on there. In Visual Studio, you may be required to specify how big this array is. With genuine C++, you don't have to do that. And then inside the function, you would treat the array the same way you do anywhere else. You just need to know how many indices there are. So it may be beneficial to also pass in that value. Let's say int n. So in comes the array and the size of the array. Or to make it a little bit easier to understand, we'll call that size. And in this function, I'm just going to display everything in the array. So cout, actually I need a for loop. For I equals 0, I less than size, I plus plus. And then a cout statement that shows the value of the array. And so now if I want to call this function, I can call it by name. I pass in the name of the array, which is num, and then I pass in the size. And I can see that's 3. So then we can run the program, and it works just fine. Like I said, sometimes if you're using Visual Studio, they may require you to put a 3 right there, and then you don't need this, but then your function only works with an array of 3, which is not very useful in most cases.